after a considerable amount of teething trouble, we may actually be broadcasting something to Facebook, but it's about, oh, I don't know, 30 seconds delay. So welcome if you're watching. And this is an inaugural attempt at Skeptics in the Hub. So you're all trailblazers. Somebody's got to do it first of all, and it's us. And tonight I have Jeremy Hess, who's going to tell us how to say vegan, vegan, whatever.
Hopefully I've got a few more things than that too. Hello everyone. Thanks for having me on, John. Great that we're able to sort this out. I think we're there now. Streaming to Facebook and we've got this going.
Only an hour late. So how do you say it?
Yeah, I would just say vegan myself, but I think we're all coming from different accents, so there's probably a few different ways to say it. That's my blended American, New Zealand, and possibly a bit of English influence in the accent, the way I would say it.
It's Microsoft versus Facebook. No, Microsoft versus...
You know, I think whatever you just did, I think seems to have worked, because I know on my end, your volume just about doubled.
Good. Okay. Right.
Now... Yeah.
Okay, so where were we? I'm coming from the point of evolution and biology. So, you know, I'm not against animal rights in any way. I'm an animal lover. I had 3 dogs when I was a boy at home, one of whom was effectively my brother, because, you know, I was an only child. And this dog and I struck up a very close relationship. And I've got 2 sons who are left home and in different parts of the world. And they've both had dogs or got dogs and cats in the case of, both of them, I think, now. They seem to pick up a menagerie. So I'm definitely an animal lover. I'm definitely in favor of treating animals, you know, as humanely as possible. I can't deny biology. So you were telling us a bit about how you got to where you are from Middle West Ohio, weren't you? Do you want to carry on with that?
Yeah, I think maybe a portion of the group has kind of heard a bit of my introduction, so I'll kind of go a bit quickly through that. So, but yeah, I was just talking about how I grew up in a part of the U.S. that uses animals quite frequently, and visiting the farm that my mom's parents, you know, grew up on, and, you know, thinking that animal use was perfectly natural, normal, and necessary, and just kind of the stages I went through, because I know for me, it was a bit like peeling back the layers of the onion, you know, growing up believing these things, and, you know, gradually seeing a new layer appear. I know after, you know, that early childhood development, the next 2 key steps for me were my sister telling us stories around animal rights at the dinner table when I was about 8 years old. And then most notably when I went to university and went to Switzerland and read Diet for a New America, which really got me thinking about other animals in a new way. And walking around the Swiss Alps, you know, seeing the cows there, I really started to see them as someone versus something. And
you're going to burst into song in a minute, aren't you?
I may just. And I think the key part in this is, for me, I was vegetarian and pescatarian for about 12 years before actually choosing to live vegan. And for me, it was the pivotal moment was scrolling through my social media feed. And normally I just skip over posts around specifically the so-called dairy. And for whatever reason, I chose to watch this post, and it was completely non-graphic, but it showed that separation that happens between a mom and her calf. For those who aren't familiar, that's talking about biology, that's a part of the requirement, you know, for these cows to produce sufficient milk for us to use them. They have to give birth, like us, 9 months pregnancy. And just seeing the 2 of them, you know, start to you know, the mom with the son, and really kind of start to bond. And you know, that should have been the start of a long relationship, but as a lot of us probably know, it wasn't. You know, a human interceded, separated the two of them, picked up the calf, carried them to their vehicle, and as they started to drive further apart, you could just see the mom just starting to realize the gravity of what was happening and trying to do what she could. But I think we all know how that story goes. And I just know for me, it was a 2-minute video, and it just impacted me so profoundly because I could just see in her eyes the questions. I felt like she was talking to me, saying, you know, what have I done to deserve this? You know, somebody make it stop. Where are you taking him? And it was from that moment forward that it really just switched. And, you know, 6 years ago, I started living vegan, and more recently really pursued the advocacy and campaigning for these things a bit further. And yeah, and that's pretty much brings us up to where we are today. So that's kind of a high level overview.
It is very obviously traumatic, that separation. And worse than that, if possible, is the fact that the male calves have to be disposed of because they're never going to grow up to become milkers.
And I think that, to me, that's a great point, John, because I know, to me, that's I guess we talked a little bit earlier about the difference between a diet versus a lifestyle. And I think for me, that's a key distinction from the dietary aspect of it between vegetarianism and veganism, because both cows used for their milk and a chicken who's used for her eggs, there's still that killing of the male offspring, as well as the cycle of impregnation and use of the females until they no longer produce. And that's what really, I mean, I thought I was ticking the box, honestly, for 12 years. And that's what really just kind of flipped it for me. And that's why I'm so passionate to kind of talk about these things. And I'm so thankful for the opportunity to do that, you know, with you and the group tonight.
Yeah, sure. Part of this, I think, comes out of a religious tradition which specifies that man is separate and superior to the animals. And therefore, we've been put here, you know, ostensibly to husband them, to rule over them, the flowers of the field and, you know, the fish of the sea and so on and so forth. My biblical quotes are no good. But more recently, of course, we've come to appreciate that there's a continuum, and the large mammals are quite similar to us with emotions, and they can feel pain and so on and so forth. And you've only got to own a dog for a very short period of time to realize that they understand, to a large extent, what's going on.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. Because I think I've got a few friends here as well that have followed, you know, familiar with kind of my side of things. I'm very passionate about the language side of things, and even just, you know, something I know I've tried to move away from myself is even, you know, we have 2 dogs that we share a home with, and even moving away from saying that we own them, because to own them would indicate that they're property. And then all this whole cycle, you know, like you say, this human superiority starts to kick into it, and saying, you know, we're the humans and we own the dogs, and trying to break that down. But yeah, back to your point as far as the extent. Sorry, go ahead.
But we don't own the cats; they own us.
Yeah, that's right. The cats own us, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you raised a really good point around kind of the extent to which they experience life, which I think to me, that's what really excites me about the philosophy of animal rights is those kinds of discussions. And I really enjoy having them. But I think at a fundamental level, to me, all that really matters is, do they experience those things? To the extent which they experience those things, I think is you know the pleasure, pain, all those things is, I think, more of a sidebar to the core of the issue. But I do agree it's a conversation that's certainly interesting to have, and I think can help provide some more background.
The jury is still out, really, in terms of science, I think, but it's certainly leaning further and further towards thinking that we share a great deal in common with the higher mammals. Oh, I shouldn't have said higher. It implies some sort of trajectory.
And honestly, John, I mean, I routinely every day I'll have a thought or even say something, and then I'll challenge myself on it, because this speciesism, which I view kind of more as an ideology that we're just surrounded by, all these institutions, be it government or, you know, the list goes on, the schools, it's really rampant throughout society. It's really tough to unlearn that. So it's I think as long as we're asking ourselves the questions and really challenging why we're using the words we're choosing to use, that's a start. So
absolutely, yes.
Go ahead.
Always challenge. Always be critical, even of yourself.
That's what the Worthing Skeptics is all about, right? Being skeptical.
Definitely.
I don't know. Since we started a bit late to keep things a bit shorter. I don't know if it makes sense to show the video I prepared, and then that might help to create some conversation that you and I and maybe the group can ask some questions too.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Are you able to see the screen share option from my screen like before?
Yes, I can share that. There we go.
So that's that. And if I move this over, and everybody should see a picture of me hugging a cow. Yep. Which this is at a local sanctuary called Friend Animal Sanctuary in Kent. Now, with any luck, I think people should be able to see that. Now, when it starts playing, you may need to change the volume level. Are you able to make that full screen, or I guess we can leave it like it is?
I think you would have to make it full screen.
I'm showing full screen, but let's just it seems to be working. So let's just go with where it is. So just a little bit of a setup for the video. It's probably one of the most influential speeches that has ever been given on what I like to refer to as genuine animal rights, or rights-based animal rights, which perhaps we can explore a bit more in the Q&A. And it basically goes through several species of other animals, and it shows them both as the unique individuals that they are, as well as how their rights are violated in various different ways. And while it does show other animals at their end, it is a lot less graphic than I know a lot of the footage I've seen. But with that in mind, it does come with a content warning that if you're aware of these issues, you know, you can always listen to the audio and perhaps, you know, look away. But for those who haven't necessarily embraced the philosophy of animal rights, I guess being skeptical, I would encourage us to challenge ourselves that if we don't want to look at this, why would we want to support others and by paying them to do these things? So, and to me, really the focus of this issue is what we can do in our day-to-day lives and the animals who are the potential victims of our choices. So with that, I'll leave you to enjoy the video, and please feel free to correct the audio on your end if you need to.
Can I just say that you're right about them being individuals. You've only got to have 2 dogs to know how different they are from each other. Yeah, and at Friend, they care for 200 different individuals, and I can attest that each one of them is their own being with their own life. Yeah. All right. Well, with that.
The other animals humans eat, use in science, hunt, trap, and exploit in a variety of other ways have a life of their own that is of importance to them apart from their utility to us. They are not only in the world, they are aware of it and also of what happens to them. And what happens to them matters to them. Each has a life that fares experientially better or worse for the one whose life it is. Like us, they bring a unified psychological presence to the world. Like us, they are some bodies, not some things. In these fundamental ways, the non-human animals in labs and on farms, for example, are the same as human beings. And so it is that the ethics of our dealings with them and with one another must rest on some of the same fundamental moral principles. At its deepest level, an enlightened human ethic is based on the independent value of the individual. To treat human beings in ways that do not honor their independent worth, to reduce them to the status of tools or models or commodities, for example, is to violate that most basic of human rights, the right to be treated with respect. The philosophy of animal rights demands only that logic be respected, for any argument that plausibly explains the independent value of human beings implies that other animals have the same value and have it equally. And any argument that plausibly explains the right of humans to be treated with respect also implies that these other animals have the same right and have it equally also. The general public has tended to view advocates of animal rights in exclusively negative terms. We are anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-rational, anti-human. We stand against justice and for violence. The truth, as it happens, is quite the reverse. The philosophy of animal rights is on the side of reason. For it is not rational to discriminate arbitrarily. And discrimination against non-human animals is demonstrably arbitrary. It is wrong to treat weaker human beings, especially those who are lacking in normal human intelligence, as tools or models, for example. It cannot be rational, therefore, to treat other animals as if they were tools, models, and the like, if their psychology is as rich as or richer than these human beings. The philosophy of animal rights is pro, not anti-science. This philosophy is respectful of our best science in general and of evolutionary biology in particular. The latter teaches that, in Darwin's words, humans differ from many other animals in degree and not in kind. Questions about line drawing to one side, it is obvious that the animals used in laboratories, raised for food, and hunted for pleasure or trapped for profit, for example, are our psychological kin. This is not fantasy. It's fact, supported by our best science. The philosophy of animal rights stands for, not against, justice. We are not to violate the rights of the few so that the many might benefit. Slavery allows this. Child labor allows this. All unjust social institutions allow this, but not the philosophy of animal rights, whose highest principle is that of justice. The philosophy of animal rights stands for peace and against violence. The fundamental demand of this philosophy is to treat humans and other animals with respect. This philosophy, therefore, is a philosophy of peace, but it is a philosophy that extends the demand for peace beyond the boundaries of our species. For there is an undeclared war being waged every day against countless millions of non-human animals. To stand truly for peace is to stand firmly against their ruthless exploitation. And what, aside from the common menu of media distortions, what will be said by the opponents of animal rights? Will the objection be that we are equating animals and humans in every respect, when in fact humans and animals differ greatly? But clearly we are not. Saying that humans and other animals are the same in every way, that dogs and cats can do calculus, or that pigs and cows enjoy poetry. What we are saying is that, like humans, many other animals have an experiential welfare of their own. In this sense, we and they are the same. In this sense, therefore, despite our many differences, we and they are equal. Will the objection be that we are saying that every human and every animal has the same rights, that chickens should have the right to vote, and pigs the right to ballet lessons? But of course, we are not saying this. All we are saying is that these animals and humans share one basic moral right, the right to be treated with respect. Will the objection be that because animals do not respect our rights, we therefore have no obligation to respect their rights either? But there are many human beings who have rights and are unable to respect the rights of others. Young children and the mentally enfeebled and deranged of all ages. In their case, we do not say that it is perfectly all right to treat them as tools or models or commodities because they do not honor our rights. On the contrary, we recognize that we have a duty to treat them with respect. What is true of cases involving these human beings is no less true of cases involving other animals. Will the objection be that if other animals do have more, even if other animals do have moral rights, there are other more important things that need our attention: world hunger and child abuse, for example, apartheid, drugs, violence to women, the plight of the homeless. After we take care of these problems, then we can worry about animal rights. This objection, this is the mark for the rank and file of the animal rights movement, is composed of people whose first line of service is human service. Doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, people involved in a broad range of social services, from rape counseling to aiding victims of child abuse or famine or discrimination. Teachers at every level of education. People face is not between either helping humans or helping other animals. One can do both. We should do both. Will the objection be finally that no one has rights, not any human being and not any other animal either, but rather that right and wrong are a matter of acting to produce the best consequences, being certain to count everyone's interests and to count equal interests equally? This moral philosophy, utilitarianism, has a long and venerable history. Influential men and women, past and present, were among its adherents, and yet it is a bankrupt moral philosophy if ever there was one. Are we seriously to inquire into the interests of the rapist before declaring rape wrong? Should we ask the child molester whether his interests would be frustrated before condemning the molestation of our children? Remarkably, a consistent utilitarianism demands that we ask these questions, and in so demanding relinquishes any claim on our rational assent. With regard to the philosophy of animal rights, then, is it rational, impartial, scientifically informed? Does it stand for peace and against injustice? To all these questions, the answer is an unqualified yes. And as for the objections that are raised against this philosophy, are those who accept it able to offer rational, informed answers? Again, the answer is yes. In the battle of ideas, the philosophy of animal rights wins, its critics lose. It remains to be seen which side emerges as the victor in the ongoing political battle between what is just and what is not. Thank you.
Yes, that's a powerful piece of video. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for letting me share that. So that's the first time actually that's been shared publicly. So a few firsts tonight. So both Skeptics in the Hub, inaugural, and for that. So
yeah. Trailblazing again. So a couple of points.
Yeah.
He talked about, it was noticeable that at the beginning, the animals shown were mammals. And then some minutes later, we had a few birds. And then later still, we had some fish. And then there was a turtle, I think, a reptile. And the commentator mentioned the expression arbitrary distinctions. So I'm just wondering whether they are arbitrary. I mean, there were no spiders there, were there? The animals that attract our sympathy are the warm, cuddly, furry, feathery ones, aren't they? I don't mean horrible, hairy spiders in furry.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the two things that come up for me around that are both around, I think we mentioned earlier, around that kind of human superiority and that speciesism, which I think, just to help explore what speciesism really means at an individual level, is just that looking at someone else as being not having moral value simply because of the species that they belong to. I never had the pleasure of meeting Tom Reagan. Sadly, he passed away a couple of years ago. However, I take it to mean that it's arbitrary in the sense that they're saying literally the only difference is the species. Yes, fish can swim faster than us, leopards can run faster than us, and so on. That doesn't make them superior to us, at a basic moral level. So why should it be the other way around? Is that kind of the question you're thinking about from the arbitrariness of it?
I see where you're coming from. You're you're trying to assign a value judgment to a species and say that we shouldn't consider there to be anything superior and anything inferior. And you're right, because that's not what evolution has done. There's been no trend, no intention, no directionality to go from simple and rudimentary through to sophisticated and complex. It's just happened. And the thing that I would like to add to that is it's success that is the measure that we should be applying here, not a value judgment that we determine on some quality of our own choosing. And to get success, what you need is to protect lives of your family, first and foremost, your own, then your family, then your tribe, then your nation, then your species. And if you do that, if you've got empathy for your fellow members and you nurture and try to help to increase the size of the population and conquer more environments, then your species will become successful. But none of it requires a value judgment. We're not saying we're better in any respect. What we're saying is it's measurably successful in terms of numbers. There's 7.4 billion of us, and we've done that by being good parents and good looking after the human race individuals.
Yeah, and I think it sounds like the way you're framing things, it kind of boils down to how we define success. Because it sounds like if we're looking, I think you mentioned the number of the human population. To me, there's a really pivotal thing is the human-centric versus animal-centric framing. And when I say animal-centric, I include us in that because we're animals too. However, I think if we look at our success from purely from our population growing, I think that might leave out our the relationship we have with the other inhabitants of this world and the environment itself. So to me, success is finding a way to thrive with other animals than rather them thriving for us.
Definitely. I mean, we live in an environment which we have to protect, because if we ruin it, then we can't live. So that is a link that has to be worked at. We have to be good husbanders of planet Earth. But does this mean that we should consider all species to be equal, to have equal rights? I mean, we didn't give smallpox virus much of a right, did we, when we eradicated it?
Well, I think there's two things there. I mean, I think the first, or the second actually, from a virus perspective, I would put that in the category of self-defense. I think if we're being attacked, that's quite a different scenario than animal use as we see it today. Well, I mean, I think just taking a step back when we're looking at this, I mean, from a biology perspective that you're coming from, I mean, would you say there's any necessity for us to eat or use other animals?
Yes. I've prepared a bit of a on that.
Yeah, let's get into, because to me that's kind of the groundwork, and then we can move up from there. Yeah,
sure. Okay, so let me go through what I've written down here before the event. Well, first of all, we're made of protein. Flesh is protein. We're about, I don't know, 25%, maybe more than that, made of protein. There's some fat, but we're mostly protein. And so if we eat animals, we're eating sort of concentrated food, because it's got more of the stuff that can make us. Most plant material has very little protein. So that you could consider that to be dilute food as far as making, you know, new bits of humans is concerned. And I mean, if you take the various organs of a plant, leaves are 90% water, and the next most prolific component is cellulose. It's a box round every cell. And mammals at least, can't digest that because we lack cellulase. It's not just humans, it's, you know, mammals in general lack cellulase, the enzyme that's necessary to digest the cell wall and enable access to the contents of plant cells where you would find tiny amount of protein. So the only way plant leaves can be utilized by animals is with the assistance of bacteria, because bacteria do possess cellulase, and mammals and birds have them in a symbiotic relationship so that the bacteria can help them to get the nourishment from their food. And they provide them with a nice, warm, damp, oxygenated space where they can do that. And this is a rather slow process, the digestion of cellulose. So you need a big container for the food to be in for a period of time in order for the digestion to happen. It's a bit like rotting. It's a bit like a compost heap. And if you think about the large herbivores, they're mostly gut. Have you seen the size of a cow's intestines, you know? And think of an elephant. It's got a big abdomen for this very reason, in order to contain a compost heap, effectively. And the large herbivores also have very often, I mean, the cow, for example, has 5 stomachs. And in order to aid the digestion of this rather tough food material, it regurgitates its meal from the first stomach back to his mouth and gives it a second chew, chewing the cud before swallowing it again. But even so, they can't spend much time during a day not eating. In order to get fed, they have to have their nose in the grass pretty much all the time because it's very dilute nourishment. Now, that's not true of herbivores, of course. They don't have to have they don't need to carry around a compost heap. They have quite small abdomens by contrast. They don't need to eat very often. A lion is happy with a meal once every 2 or 3 days. And a snake is happy to eat a mouse, for example, once a week, because it doesn't have to keep its body warm. And that's the expensive consumption of fuel. So small herbivores have a different problem because they don't have enough space in their abdomen to carry around sufficient bacteria. So what they do, and I'm thinking of rabbits here, is they eat their poo. They are coprophagous. And the first pass through the gut produces a sort of green poo, which they then eat and pass through the gut again in order to extract the nourishment from it. And birds, if you take birds as an example, they obviously, if they need to fly, they can't have a big body, so they can't carry around a compost heap, and they can't therefore live on leaves. The small birds must eat seeds or insects or nectar, for example, concentrated food. And the big-bodied birds must eat meat, eagle, the vulture. And there is an exception. The swan is a herbivore, but it can barely, a big bird, but it can barely take off. So the point is, we're omnivores. We have a few bacteria in our bowels to help digestion, but we are adapted to live a mixed diet. And it's unlikely that humans would have evolved as herbivores. And being omnivores enables us to do things other than spend all day with our nose in the trough. We were able to develop tools, we were able to develop habitations, and we were able to control fire. And of course, fire enabled us to pre-soften food by cooking it, making it more easy to digest without the aid of the bacteria that we can't really accommodate in sufficient numbers. And of course, eating some meat enables us to consume animal fat, which is necessary to develop a large brain. Nervous systems are made mostly of fat. So it's very unlikely that a clever, medium-sized biped mammal called a human would have come about without eating some meat. And if you look at our relatives, our closer relatives, a gorilla is pretty much herbivorous, lives on pretty much leaves. But have you seen the size of his belly? I mean, it's got a lot of gut in there. And a chimpanzee, they occasionally eat meat. They're omnivores, a bit like us. So we're not adapted, simply not adapted to live off leaves. And if we're going to not eat meat, and by the way, I'm not trying to preach to convert anybody here. What you put in your mouth is entirely up to you. I'm not authoritarian about this. But in order to buy without eating meat, you can't manage on leaves. You've got to eat the best bits of plants. You've got to eat the bits of plants where they concentrated the protein and the fat. You've got to eat their reproductive bodies, their seeds, their nuts, their beans. And that diet, with sufficient variation, is only available in rich countries. You can't get access to it in the poor parts of the world. We're not allowed to call them third world anymore. We've got to call them developing countries. But the point is, they don't have Sainsbury's with an aisle full of 74 different cereal packets, you know? So it's a privilege, really, to be a vegetarian. And only a few people in the West can afford to indulge in it. The majority of the human population can't afford to. And the other thing to consider is what's going to happen to our domestic species. Currently, there's millions of cows, millions of sheep, pigs, chickens. If we stop eating them, they're all going to die. How many will there be? Who's going to keep a pet cow? Eh? And you can make an argument based on this that we should eat pandas to save them from extinction, give them an economic value.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of the thoughts a lot of people have. I'll do my best to go through the key points, I guess, point by point. If I miss anything, though, that you feel is worthwhile revisiting, yeah, please let me know. I think looking from a biological requirement perspective, I agree with you. We are omnivores, which means we can eat both. However, to me, it's more from a moral consideration perspective. Should we eat both? Which I think is a really key distinction there. I think we can get into the ancestry and, you know, are we more like herbivores versus omnivores and all these things. However, you're the biologist, I'm not. To me, I think at a basic level, I look to the experts, what our best science has to offer, and the UK Dietetics Association, as well as every other major medical body in the world, has said that a well-planned vegan diet is suitable for all stages of life. And I think when people see the well-planned, they might get scared off by that, but all diets should be well-planned. So to me, they are just saying outright that we can live without eating or using other animals. I think from a nutrient perspective, you hit on a few things there. I think I challenge that eating animals is more nutrient dense. I would agree it's more calorie dense. I think that's not necessarily a good thing if the nutrients aren't there. We talked about protein and fat. I think to me, a really key thing is fiber. 95% of Westerners are fiber deficient. I haven't come across anyone with a protein deficiency that's taking in an adequate number of calories. So to me, it shouldn't be where are we going to get our protein? The question we should be asking ourselves is where are we going to get our fiber?
You're right, of course. We need fiber because it's what bulks our gut up and enables it to operate. And the other point about you don't see people with a fiber with a protein deficiency. Well, lucky. I mean, if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, you will see children suffering from a disease called kwashiorkor, with a big swollen belly and bony and skin limbs because they don't get enough protein. They only get, I don't know, a bowl of rice a day or whatever, you know, whatever.
I don't know that it's just protein, though. Are they getting enough calories?
No, it's protein deficiency. Kwashiorkor is a protein deficiency disease condition. Yeah. It's because what they get is probably millet, whatever the local grain is. It's not rice because that doesn't grow in Africa very well, but it's, you know, millet or what's it called? Sago? No, sweet potatoes, things like that, which are pretty much pure starch with very, very little protein. And that's as bad a diet as, you know, one in which I was thinking of the ketone diet, which has become a fad lately, where you only eat meat or you don't mix it with other items of on your plate.
Yeah, and I think that's where the well-planned part of it comes into it, because I agree all diets should be balanced, and in developing countries that is a challenge. I think one of the things I was really shocked to learn is that, what is it, around 30,000 humans starve to death each day. Mm-hmm. And every night when we go to sleep, you can guarantee that the animals who are raised for their bodies to be eaten, they'll all go to bed nice and full. So if our priorities are really human-centric, shouldn't we be feeding the humans before these other animals? Because due to feed conversion ratios, it takes 2 to 20 times the amount of calories to filter the plants through other animals versus eating the plants directly. Mm. So oftentimes what you have is in these developing countries, they're actually growing plants or even animals, but that's being shipped off to Western countries. Mm. So I'm not trying to present this as a perfect solution, but I think it helps us ask some of the questions that we should be asking. I mean, I think the situation you describe and some of the poverty, I think we've probably all seen a bit of that on TV and elsewhere, and it's devastating. However, I really challenge that that's because they're getting a balanced plant-based diet, as it were, as a subset of the vegan philosophy.
Yeah, as I said, getting a balanced plant-based diet is a Western privilege. You know, it's not something that's available in the Congo or the Namib Desert where the pygmies live.
If I may, I mean, what about developing countries such as India? And I mean, it's some of the most developing countries on the planet subsist on rice, beans, and so forth. I mean, rice and beans are a complete protein.
But with a little bit of, I mean, apart from those who, is it the Buddhists who won't eat any meat? But apart from those, they consume a little bit of fish and some goat meat. Not cows, of course, because they're sacred. But they're not entirely vegetarian, quite a lot of them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we're still fairly early days of this. I mean, the Vegan Society was only founded about 70 years ago. So I think we don't really have those large population studies yet. Mm-hmm. I guess the reason I quote the UK Dietetics Association is that they've looked at the biology, and on an individual level, they've said there's no nutrient that we need to get from other animals. And in my experience, it's actually been the opposite, that plant-based foods are actually more nutrient dense, not calorie dense, but nutrient dense. So not just fiber, but all those micronutrients. Macronutrient wise, yeah, you might be able to hit the macros, but from a micro perspective, I think it's a lot more challenging on an animal-based diet. But I just want to say I'm not a dietitian, so these are my opinions. I encourage everyone to, in the spirit of this group, be skeptical and look into these things for yourself.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you're right. If you have access to a wide and varied range of plant food material, then you can get a perfectly adequate diet. But there's one.
So if I may, in the UK, do you think that you do have that access? Do you think you could subsist on a plant-based, focusing on the dietary experts, not all the forms of animal use, but do you think that biologically we can?
Yes.
Survive on plants? Yeah.
It's definitely
okay. So it's more kind of a cultural perspective and individual, like certain situations where you think it might be more challenging for some than others. Is that the?
It's definitely possible to have a healthy diet as a vegetarian or vegan in Europe and America and Australia, other parts of the world that are rich. But elsewhere, there's one amino acid which is not present in local plants, and the variety of plants available to them is insufficient, and so they do suffer from that deficiency. There's also, of course, the problem of a vitamin. I forget which vitamin. Is it vitamin A? No, that's
B12.
B12. That's the one. Yes, B12, which is present in liver and meat, but it's quite hard to find in plants. You get it in brown bread, for example, but unless you have access to a few special plants, you're going to have a deficiency of B12.
Yeah, and I'm quite happy to talk about B12 because I know that's one that comes up a lot. And honestly, I think that it's something we should all be talking about. And the reason for that is approximately 39% of Westerners have a B12 deficiency, and only about 1% of the population is vegans. So to me, it's not solely a vegan issue. It's something that we all have. Something that we should consider. And I think there's lots of intricacies that go into that on an individual absorption level. I would encourage everyone to talk to their doctors about supplementing or potentially even getting injections if they have low homocysteine and might have difficulty absorbing it. But at a fundamental level, to me, this is not to be conflated with veganism. This is a separate issue that deals with sterilization and modern practices that have actually washed off a lot of the dirt that vitamin B12 can be found in. Plus, one last point, if I may, the animals who are raised to be eaten for their flesh are injected with B12. So even if we're against taking supplements, we're getting supplements either way. So that is one thing that I think both vegans and everyone should really consider. That's the one thing I take a B12 supplement. It's super cheap, and then I'm sorted.
We need a vet in this link, don't we? I'm not sure that injecting B12 into British animals happens. I'm sure it does in the US because, they inject hormones, everything into them, and then wash it in chlorine water.
It looks like we've got 18 people on the live Facebook video. I think I'd love to hear what it looks like we've been getting a lot of comments, so some sub-discussion in there. Yep. If anybody of those 18 would like to just look up for UK, B12 injected into other animals, and I'd be happy to do that as well. But actually, it might be, if you're open to it, John, it might be interesting to see if any of our group has any questions of their own, because maybe if those of the 18 that are watching, if they can just start their comment with Q or question, so we know it's a question and they're not responding to somebody else.
Good idea.
And we can let those kind of filter in, and then, because it'd be great, because I mean, both John and I, it sounds like we could probably talk about this for hours, but great to get some others in here. Steve's asking if he can join the stream. Can I put him up? More the merrier. Here he comes. Hi, Steve.
Hello. Hi, Ron. Hi, yeah. Sorry, what's your name? Who am I speaking to? It's Jeremy. Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. Yeah, I think I'm mostly on your side in this discussion, and I think you made some really good points. But I wanted to get your opinion on things like conservation, for example, that maybe require us to keep animal numbers under control to continue to be able to conserve them. So, for example, let's say a landowner in England. He has he owns a bit of woodland, and he keeps deer in his wood. And if he didn't cull them and keep their numbers under control, then it would be bad for the deer. And so he allows people to come onto his farm with a gun and maybe every now and then kill an older animal, or and then what would you think about that? What would you think about not wasting that meat once that animal has been killed? Is that not an ethical thing to want to preserve those species in some cases, and part of that involves maintaining their numbers and keeping their numbers under control?
Can I add a little bit to that? Because I watched a TV program featuring Hugh Fernley Whittingstall, or whatever his name is, and he was telling us about some forests which have become overpopulated with deer, and the deer have eaten everything up to, as high as they can reach when they stand on their hind legs. And that means that all the seedling trees have gone. So this forest is doomed unless the deer are culled.
Because they've got, in the wild, they would have natural predators, right? Like wolves, which we've hunted to extinction here in the UK.
We've got...
so, yeah, we maybe we need to play the part of those wolves in some parts.
Can we dress up?
Well, I think, Steve, you raised some honestly, some really thought-provoking questions, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers because, quite frankly, I don't. Right. And to me, I think this is an example where the philosophy of animal rights doesn't necessarily provide all the answers. It sometimes asks us more questions. I think specifically when it comes to deers and some of the species that some might consider invasive, I guess I think you mentioned kind of not wasting their meat or their flesh. To me, from a philosophy of animal rights perspective, my primary concern would be not wasting their life, as it were. So actually valuing their life as an individual over their body as property, especially as we previously established, there's no biological necessity to eat or use them. So it's not like we need their flesh. But that, I think, is more of a sidebar to the overall conservation issue mentioned. And I think this kind of relates back to the feed conversion ratios, because if 2 to 20 times the amount of plant calories are taken to filter through other animals rather than eating the plants directly, that's not just from a plant perspective. That's from a land, a water, all kinds of other things that we have to use to grow all those extra crops. And if we focus on eating the plants directly, the amount of space that's taken up to grow these crops shrinks dramatically. So there's still going to be some delicate balance and things to explore to minimize our impact on free living beings. However, I think there's the vegan side of the equation helps us to explore some of these things, and there's a whole new movement towards organic farming and growing green that, to be honest, is still there's still a lot of things to figure out in that space. But I think it's all how we frame it. If we frame it, humans are expanding, how do we deal with these invasive species versus, humans are animals, how can we exist with these other species? I think that might help to answer some of those questions. Does that kind of start to answer some of your points?
Well, no, because I wasn't really talking about them as if they were invasive species. It's more that, we want to keep them around because we don't want them to go extinct. And so we have some land, a woodland, and we want to have deer on that land because we think there is value in keeping these species alive and stopping them from going extinct. And that necessarily involves, for their own well-being, keeping their numbers under control.
And so I think actually John mentioned this in a part of his the points he raised was around what's going to happen to these domesticated or animals who are used, and are they gonna die? And my answer to that is, well, they're going to be killed anyway for the ones who are here when we're using them. But as far as free living species and preventing species extinction, animal use is the leading cause of species extinction. So if we're concerned about...
I don't want to justify, farming practices necessarily. I was just talking about, it's sure, yeah, animal use is Yeah, I mean, I think you can get on board with 90% of the ideas that come out of veganism, but yeah, I just think so I could agree that the way we farm animals is cruel and unnecessary and perhaps leads to extinction. And I could agree that we could get by eating plants, but I still think that there is a place for trying to carve out territories and habitats for wild animals, and that involves keeping their numbers under control. Likewise, it's when we look at things like, say, game farms in Africa, we don't want a lot of those big species to go extinct, and it's just a fact of life that for them to be able to afford to run those reserves, they need to be able to allow hunters to come in occasionally and to shoot maybe the sickly animals or the older animals, because if they didn't keep the numbers under control, then it would cause bad things for the animals, and they need the money to be able to finance their game farm and to be able to have that wild space where those animals can exist.
Yeah, and I think from a conservation perspective, going back to the deers issue that you mentioned, I think a lot of the reason why there are so many is because we've killed a lot of the predators.
Yeah.
As far as, it sounds like we're on a similar page from an animal use perspective, obviously having negative impacts on the ecosystem and so forth. And I think oftentimes if we just left things alone, the ecosystem would probably get better off. And if we hadn't actually killed off all these predators, my suspicion is the deer numbers would balance out more on their own. So I think that's part of it too. So, but I think you look at the biomass and diversity. I encourage everyone to look it up on their own, but the figures are staggering, especially when you look at them over the last few decades of humans versus animals who are farmed or used, and actual free living beings has shrunk dramatically as a result of these things. So I agree. I completely agree. It's something we should definitely strive for. To me, I think to frame these things within the philosophy of animal rights helps us to find a more moral solution. I guess, should we go to some of the Facebook questions maybe?
Yeah, I've been putting a few up there, but I just wanted to say another, you're off, are you? Okay, bye-bye, Steve. Another aspect is,
by the way.
Yeah, another aspect is the medical aspect, isn't it? I mean, if anybody who's had a blood transfusion can thank dogs and the rhesus monkey, because it was in those species that we learned how to transfuse blood. We learned about the blood groups and how if you mix them, it's a disaster, causing death. And there are lots of instances like this where medical conditions have been piloted in species, and we have benefited from that.
So is this from an animal testing perspective?
Yes. Are we wrong to test things in guinea pigs and rats?
Well, I think you raised an interesting point, which I think there's a question from Ian regarding delving more into animal rights versus diets. And I think both in the chat and for us live here, to me, I think there's a key distinction that might be a bit more subtle for those less familiar with the animal issues, but within the movement, there's a key distinction between the philosophy of utilitarianism, which was touched on in the video, and the philosophy of animal rights. Now, from a utilitarian perspective, there could, in some forms of it, be a case made to test on a few to benefit and potentially reduce the total suffering. From a rights-based perspective, we look at each individual as being a rights bearer, and if we were to use any of them, we would violate their rights. From a testing specifics perspective, 90% of all tests on animals as models for human diseases fail. So that's 90% of the tests where animals are killed, and it amounts to a whole lot of nothing unless you want to know what doesn't work. For those of us who have joined from the beginning, if you look at the testing footage with the beagles and the monkeys and the mice, I don't know how anyone would necessarily morally justify that. And one last point, there's an exciting bit of a groundbreaking lab in Canada that is doing non-animal testing. So in the narration, some might recall how Tom Reagan mentioned that, the philosophy of animal rights isn't anti-science. It actually embraces our best science, both from a biological and from a testing perspective. This lab in Canada is actually using human cadavers, 3D printing, computer modeling to try to test some of these diseases. To me, if we can move in that direction and not violate others' rights, that's where we should start asking those questions.
Yes, obviously that's the way we should be going. And the other point to make is that growing plant food is a much more efficient use of land. And if we're going to feed an ever-expanding population, then obviously our diet is going to become less meaty. But then on the subject of vitamin B12, if you're a meat eater and you suffer from a deficiency of it, it's probably because of food fashion. We don't eat liver and kidney as much as we used to. Our tastes have changed.
Yeah, and I think that also goes back to that modern sterilization. I know that strips away because, going back 100 or more years, you'd eat some, dirt with the vegetables. Now we want this, like you say, the fashion of food, I think that goes along with that is we want a perfectly washed carrot. Not just that, but we want a perfectly, shaped carrot. And, instead of the wonky veg with a bit of dirt on it. I think if we went back to those days, maybe we wouldn't need to take supplements. I don't know. And I think one more point as you were talking, you got me thinking, back to the animal testing side of things. I think one of the key reasons why a lot of these tests fail is because we're not mice, we're not monkeys, and we're not beagles. Yeah. Yes. So if you want to test how a disease is going to operate on a beagle, a great way to do that,
yes,
the ethics aside, is a test on a beagle. But if we want to know how these diseases are going to interact with a human biology, as a biologist yourself, actually, that's maybe a good point to explore a bit further from a biologist's perspective. How do you feel about using those new forms of non-animal based testing and moving in that direction versus this, what seems to be quite inefficient and unethical form of animal testing?
Well, certainly. I mean, one of the forms of animal testing which I do not support, I think they've stopped it now, but it consisted of dropping drips of substances into rabbits' eyes to see how inflamed they became, to determine whether they were suitable to put in cosmetics or not. There was no need for that. There was a test, wasn't there? Another test where to test the level of toxicity of a substance, you gave it to 100 animals and counted how many of them died. And that was very cruel and unnecessary. So,
it sounds like you're referring to the LD50 test, where they basically keep overdosing the population of animals, and they keep doing it until half of them have died. And unfortunately, they're all needlessly killed in the end.
That's the one. That's the one. But being a recipient of medical treatments that were trialed in animals, I can't. It would be hypocritical of me to rule them out. But maybe going forward, we can move away from them, and I think we've been doing that ever since Anita Roddick came up with the Body Shop and pronounced that she wasn't going to use animal testing for her products. She didn't mention, of course, that she was going to use substances which had previously been animal tested.
It can be a bit of a minefield. And I think on that point, for those who are watching who may not have embraced the philosophy of animal rights or living vegan, I think that the key is to take these things day by day, and it's not about perfection. I know there's still things I'm learning about that, shock me and can get into the intricacies around that if we want to. But I think the key is really focusing on those things in our day-to-day life that we can really make a difference, and being willing to continue to learn and think about the impact. I think Paul actually has a question that you might like to field, John. It's a two-parter that it's about 20 comments up from the bottom. If you're I can read it to you, and then maybe we can try to answer it together.
What's this? I don't know.
So it's a two-parter. It starts out with what about people?
This one, I don't know of any medical condition that requires animal meat only. Is that one? Okay. Paul?
Yeah, and then the second one was also around the quality of life problem. Okay. So also there's not just moving beyond the biological requirement, but could eating or using other animals actually have harmful impact on our health?
I reckon so. But let me just tell Paul that he's looking at somebody who actually has a piece of cow in his heart, keeping him alive. And I'm in favor of that. I have a bone.
I guess it's getting into a bit of a personal thing here, and I obviously want to be mindful of that. I guess from it sounds like you maybe looked into it more than me, but my understanding is heart disease can be linked to these things. So if we, do you think that maybe if we didn't use them in the first place, we might not have to solve the issue?
No. I don't want to make it personal either, but of course I'm only an example of hundreds of people who have bovine aortic valve substitutes and are alive thanks to that. And in my case, it certainly wasn't, I didn't need it as a result of having overconsumed meat. It was a condition that I was born with and managed to survive until this great age. Anyway.
Well, I think if I may just chime in real quickly, are you familiar with the Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn? I might be saying their name wrong. Forgive me if I am. And there's also Dean Ornish. They've done studies where they've taken people with heart disease, and the people who've switched and completely conformed to a plant-based diet. Now, I know we're shifting back from the philosophy to the diet, but they completely either stopped and in some cases reversed their heart disease. So that's possibly a discussion that I can share some links with you afterwards, because neither of us being medical doctors, it may not be appropriate for us to field anyway, but I just want to put that out there for the group to consider.
Sure. It's certainly not appropriate in my case, because I was born with a defective heart valve, and it was always going to need to be replaced at some stage. Nothing to do with what I ate or did.
Understand. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, you said something earlier that I thought was almost a brilliant way of winding up this event, because we normally stop at 10 o'clock when we're in a pub, and it's 2 minutes to now. So it's getting to be past my bedtime.
Yeah, and I think hopefully we did a good job compressing things, even though we got started a bit late. We kind of, packed a lot in. So once we got started. So thank you everyone for kind of sticking with us.
Absolutely. I'm sorry about the technical hitch at the beginning. Maybe next time we'll know better, or not. Who cares?
Well, and I think anytime we start something new, there's going to be a bit of overhead, isn't there? So especially when it comes to technology. Yeah.
But it's one thing driving a computer. It's another thing looking under the bonnet.
Yep, that's a good way to put it. Well, I think that's an interesting thing, and I just want to put a shout out real quickly. For all of us, we're living in a really interesting time to just support and be mindful to take care of each other. And I think hopefully through video conferences and stuff like this, we can find ways to actually pull ourselves closer together, and also supporting our own local communities. Because one point that Tom Reagan touched on that I think is really important is that, to me, animal rights is kind of at the core of our basic rights that we all share, and then human rights is kind of put on top of this, so that they really play in relation to each other. So the philosophy of animal rights isn't anti-human in any sense, and we're very much pro supporting each other, and all the exciting potential that has. Because to me it makes sense, if we can respect other animals, we have a pretty strong chance of respecting other humans too. So that's, well, as you can probably tell, once you get me talking, it's hard to get me stopped. So,
so respect animals and respect humans, but not spiders.
Yeah, well, there's some. Here's an interesting thought to close on. Have you seen the video where a spider sees their reflection and jumps backwards?
Oh no, I haven't seen that one. Put a link to it in the comments. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. We'll do it again one day, and the video will be permanently on Facebook, and you will also be able to continue to comment. Bye.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you so much, John, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you, Jeremy. You've been great.
Cheers, John.